Okay, so I would like to invite Celia Zoliński and Michael Bormann to join me on stage. Fritz Bussemaker accepted at the last minute to help me co-moderate, and so he'll participate in the animation of the discussion. So the roundtable is about empowering users, shaping individual and collective empowerment tools to secure general access to information as public good. And we have online Arthur Pericles El Montero, who will also speak in this roundtable. Unfortunately, Amrita Sengupta. Amrita Sengupta told us she's sick and she cannot make it. And we'll have a video recording of the talk by Luca Belli that he sent and will display. So my name is Mehdi Kamassi. I'm a research director in cognitive science at the French National Research Center here in Paris. And so my background is scientific and pretty much related to psychology, how we make decisions. And the question of empowerment, so from my point of view, and that's, I would like to propose this as a starting point, but then to widen the discussion, is a question of how do we promote and enhance the agency of people. So what is agency is knowing that your actions can have an impact on your surrounding environment. So there's a question of tuning the environment, and the choice architectures, we'll hear about these from Michael Bormann, so as to enable people to really make deliberate decisions that help them reach the goals they set for themselves. There's the question of understanding the infrastructure, the interface, how it works, to really understand what are the alternative options, what are the possibilities of acting. And Celia Zoliński will talk about all these questions. Nevertheless, so from this starting point, I'm aware, I'm conscious that it's very focused on the individual responsibility in its decision. And there's much more than this. There are the collective empowerment. There are sociological questions. What are the other forces that come into play? And the juridical questions. So how do we transform our discussions and proposals into laws and rules and regulation that Nena has talked about? So I would like first to invite Professor Michael Bormann to start. So he's senior professor for sociology at the University of Düsseldorf, and he's scientific director at Center for Advanced Internet Studies in Germany.
Okay, thank you very much, Mehdi. So I will deal with the question of what we should understand by empowerment to act with digital interfaces in a self-determined manner, and which issues we face when trying to promote individual empowerment of users. Well, I think empowerment in digital context has three components: digital competences, legal regulations, and technological design. Regarding competences, we are witnesses in an intensive debate to clarify the scope and depth of digital competences. It seems a widespread agreement that we need comprehensive teaching of digital skills from kindergarten to the retirement home. Many dimensions should be covered: media competence for fact-checking, practical competence in protecting personal data, social competence to tackle hate speech, technical competence to understand how algorithms work, economic competence to operate in digital markets. If we take a closer look at the digital competence framework for citizens of the European Commission and the so-called competence area of information and data literacy, it is desirable to be able to articulate information needs, to locate, retrieve, and evaluate digital data, information, and content, to judge the relevance of source and be able to assess their credibility. Other competence areas include communication, collaboration, digital content, creation, problem solving, all with their own list of demanding knowledge and skills. It seems to me that we are observing in these long lists a relapse to personal responsibility in the face of losses of certainty of an analog world. But in my judgment, most of these lists include far too demanding expectations of the individual user. Two important facts must be taken into account. First, the choice environment in digital context often demands quick decisions in sometimes complicated and opaque situations when directly available information is limited. People are pressed to decide under such conditions in the mode of bounded rationality. They act according to selective personal experience and ingrained habits. They use heuristics and rules of thumb, go with the status quo or available default options, choose the first bad thing or just follow the herd. Second, this fast and frugal decision strategy is not per se unreasonable and leads in many circumstances to satisfying outcomes, even if it's not matching optimal preference maximizing choices. But to use these fast tracks is also risky, can produce biases and blunders and can easily be manipulated. Many experiments have revealed weaknesses like the status quo bias, ill-adapted heuristics, pluralistic ignorance, or hidden framing and priming. Technical teaching digital competences can be only one element in facing these challenges. Digital competences must be embedded in the design of the digital environment that avoids unrealistic demands on individual agency. We have to create a supporting choice architecture with easily identifiable and reliable solutions that nevertheless meet the aspiration levels of the users. Legal regulations and technological design are important means to create such an architecture. For a regulator, the message would be that regulations should not only regulate the what, but also the how. The UNESCO guidance rightly emphasizes that if regulation of digital platform services wants to help users to have safer, critical, and self-determined interaction, it should focus on the structures and processes. Structures and processes are indeed essential for the way choice options are presented and for the challenges that pose for finding fitting solutions. The regulation of cookies represents a good example of such a focus, but also an example of the need for further improvements. In a German law with a nice German title, Telekommunikation Telemediendatenschutzgesetz, it is stated that the request for a data subject's consent shall be presented in an intelligible and easily accessible form using clear and plain language. This wording clearly focused on how to implement the regulation. At the same time, it's quite general and leaves a lot of leeway. But the European Data Protection Board has produced several guidelines to substantiate these legal requirements. These guidelines reflect the biases which can be produced by ill-designed or manipulative choice environments. One of them is the guideline on dark patterns in social media platforms from last year. Dark patterns are considered as interfaces that lead to unintended, unwilling, and potentially harmful decisions. The guidelines offer practical recommendations on how to avoid dark patterns. For example, users should not be confronted with an overload of requests, information, or options which they cannot survey properly. Interfaces should not be designed in a skipping way that users forget or do not think about all relevant aspects of the issue under consideration. Users should not be stirred by appealing to their own emotions, and users should not be hindered by making information difficult, impossible, or prohibitively costly to achieve. The current report of the work undertaken by the Cookie Banner Task Force, this is a real title, from this year goes into even more details. It announces inter alia if buttons to reject cookies are missed on the first layer, if there are pre-ticked boxes to accept cookies, if link design is misleading, if deceptive button colors or contrast are used, or if there are no icons allowing users to withdraw their consent at any time. These lists are indeed inspired and informed by cognitive psychology and behavioral economics. However, there are mainly lists of prohibitions and not of constructive requirements. A huge discretion still remains open. But it cannot be expected that when all directly irritating and misleading influences are avoided, that users then automatically start to examine all options and their consequences in detail. I won't. In most of the cases, users will still have to decide fast and frugally, economizing on information and decision costs. At this point, technology comes into play. Innovative technological devices are an important part of a supportive digital choice architecture and of implementing regulations in an effective and user-friendly way. In regard to cookies, this could mean, for example, designing formats of presenting the relevant alternatives in a standardized and digestible way, and where the chosen options are saved for general and automated application in different contexts. Some further examples for technological devices could be easy accessible reporting channels for complaints and concerns in automated systems to process and record them. Intuitively workable tools for fact-checking and default options for trustworthy information sources. Nudges encouraging users to identify mis- and disinformation. Recommendation systems that automatically displays different sources and viewpoints. Algorithm-assisted identification and social visibility of hostility and hate in digital channels for civil society counter-strategies. Dialogue-based online argumentation systems to let users exchange proposals and arguments with each other in a time-shifted dialogue. And last but not least, natural language-based search tools like ChatGPT or U.com that interact in a conversational way, summarize findings, and give reference. The development of such digital innovations requires interdisciplinary research, creative concepts from companies, civil society initiatives, and targeted support from policymakers and regulators. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Baumann. As I mentioned before, so Amrita Singh unfortunately couldn't make it. So I would like to continue with the presentation from Celia Zolinsky. So she's professor of law at Panthéon-Sorbonne University and specialist of digital law. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mehdi, and thank you for your kind invitation. So this is a question we have, how to regulate digital platforms to protect freedom of expression and access to information while dealing with illegal and harmful content. Now, many consider that to face this systemic issue, we need systemic regulation. That could mean calling to action all the players, digital platforms and public authorities, but also end users of these digital services. In other words, end users should be considered as key players of digital platforms regulation. The figure of the end users is beginning to be taken into account, particularly in the EU, with the reform of the Digital Services Act. One of the justifications of this text is to ensure greater protection of their fundamental rights, including, of course, freedom of expression. And the DSA recognizes various means of action, for example, by consecrating complaints mechanisms and recognizing the essential action of trusted flaggers. The DSA also promotes greater transparency, for example, by imposing a duty on online platforms to describe their moderation mechanisms in their terms and conditions. And more generally, by requiring them to publish transparency reports. Also by imposing them new obligation to protect users' rights, for example, by prohibiting dark patterns you mentioned. The UNESCO guidelines for regulating online platforms also puts the end users at the heart of their proposals, promoting, for example, a special proposal to empower the users. To move toward this direction, I would like to present you briefly today the results of research carried out with academic colleagues since the last 2 years, and the French National Commission for Human Rights. One of our main proposals is to consider end users for what they are and what they should be. That means players acting in or even acting on these new digital spaces. This would mean offering end users the possibility to play the role of agents of the system in the IT sense of the term. That means allowing them to act on its architecture, so that they won't be no longer like a piece of machinery mobilized by the system. Recognizing such a role to end users would imply recognizing a form of agency. That means a capacity to act on the system, a capacity to transform the system, and a capacity to influence the system. In this way, the idea of capability developed by the Nobel Prize Amartya Sen would be extended to digital spaces. We could bring the user into movements and then extend the idea advocated by Tim Berners-Lee in the face of the web drifts to build a human vision of regulation through technology. So how should we promote end users' agency? It would be a matter of offering users the means first to understand and think about the technological constraints, and also to act on these technological constraints. So you know that understand and think about the constraint is the first step. This would require transparency to make technical processes more visible and to explain their impacts. For example, explain the functioning and effects of a recommendation mechanism by disclosing information about the instructions given to the algorithm, in particular to prioritize certain contents. Explain also the mechanisms of virality and the objectives that underlie them, notably the economic purposes. But we know that information is not sufficient. These technical constraints must also be understood well and reflected upon and then discussed publicly. This implies developing users' capacity for analyze and to create what we can call tools for reflexivity. It would be a matter of promoting mechanisms to encourage information and public debate, but also media education and digital literacy. And that are the prerequisites to users' reflexivity. This is essential, but it seems important to go beyond this by giving end user a real role as an agent capable of acting on the system. So to act on the technical constraints, they should benefit from new rights, right to mobility and right to set parameters. First, a right to mobility could allow end users to no longer be captive of certain ecosystems. Thus, this freedom to move could guarantee a freedom to choose. And the recent EU reforms could make it possible by establishing first a right to personal data portability since the adoption of the GDPR, which will be reinforced with the recent adoption of the Digital Market Act that consecrates real-time data portability. In addition, the mobility should also be ensured by the consecration of a principle of interoperability of digital services, or some of these digital services, and that is imposed now by the Digital Market Act and also discussed in the US with the Access Act. To act on the technical constraint, we should also consider recognizing a new right for end users. That's what we call a right to set parameters. That is to modify the parameters of recommendation mechanisms. This right would be a concrete expression of the proposal 65 of the UNESCO guidelines, considering that Users should be given the ability to control the algorithmic curation and recommender mechanisms used to suggest content to them. Such a right to set parameters would allow end users to build their own information space. And more generally, this would ensure that they have control over a set of parameters to determine themselves their user experience, including curation methods of the content offered to them and the way in which they are offered. It would be a matter of imposing on online platforms, especially social medias, a duty to allow the users to configure the tool made available to them according to their own interests, rather than letting their interactions be oriented and even dedicated by the sole economic interests of online platforms and their recommender mechanisms designed to enhance their users' engagements. For example, choosing the criteria for promoting or demoting the content that the user receives, deciding on the criteria for presenting information to them, or determining the audience to which they wish to expose their messages and the possibilities for comments. If we wish to promote such a right, that means such a choice, it will, however, be necessary to guarantee its effectiveness. So we have to avoid, of course, the well-known checkbox effect you mentioned, particularly when it comes to digital users. So legal design will be essential here. It has to be mobilized to make this control desirable, as the French Data Protection Authority mentioned in its work about interface architecture design. It would also be necessary to take into account the paradox of users who want to take back control and at the same time spend only a very short time on it. So we should act in two steps, maybe. First, allow users to select content appearing in their newsfeed, for example, or their searches, to indicate that they no longer wish to be exposed to such content or want to be exposed to other ones. Secondly, offer them also the possibility to access an ergonomic dashboard within their settings. This could summarize their choices and allowing them to make more general adjustments. And this dashboard should be designed as an easily accessible space, allowing the user to refer to it at any time. And the goal here could be to offer them the possibility to think about the way they want to be informed by managing their preferences. Others suggest also that the user could be given the possibility to access on the platform third-party offers proposing alternative algorithmic recommendation system. That is the project Bluebird launched by Jack Dorsey, and also the project YouChoose.ai launched in the EU. So here, access to these offers from the platform would then give users a choice of their recommender system according to their own interest and therefore the choice of what they want to see and what they want to share. And this would also expose them to more diverse content. We would then re-establish pluralism within the platforms, guarantee respect for the interests of end users, and also ensure the quality of public debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Celia. So our next speaker is Arthur Pericles Montero, who is online. Arthur, are you here? So Arthur is Associate Research Scholar at Yale Law School, and he's the Information Society project leader at Yale Law School again. So.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Good morning. It's a shame I can't be with you in person, but I've been hearing they call New Haven the Paris of Connecticut. It's also got great restaurants, all three of them. I want to thank Le Plus Important for inviting me and for hosting this panel on a topic that's very dear to me. I very much share the sense that empowering users should be a central part of our agenda and our imagination for new frameworks to govern the digital public sphere. This is at the heart of a project I'm working on here at the Yale Information Society project as part of the Wikimedia initiative on intermediaries and information. So I want to briefly share with you the motivation and questions that have been guiding my work. This is a work in progress, so I particularly welcome your thoughts. First, the motivation. I hope it's not too tongue-in-cheek to say to you sitting so close to the Bastille that I think that we might see users as the digital equivalent of the third estate in platform regulation. Everything is done in its name, but so far it has been largely ignored, and I think it should be something. We're now at a new moment for platform regulation, yet users are still relegated, I think, the same place as they have been so far. And I'll tell you why I think that. First generation regulatory approaches like the e-commerce directive in the EU or Section 230 in the US or Marco Civil in Brazil revolved around intermediary liability. Back then, many were calling for intermediaries to be held liable for user-generated content. Each of those jurisdictions responded with a model of their own, yet they all refused to make intermediaries liable for any and all content generated by users. The argument here was that it would be users themselves that would be hurt if providers were not granted some sort of immunity or safe harbor. This is most clear, I think, in the US context, where Section 230 was a response to emerging case law, which did not hold website operators liable for user-generated content if they did not exercise any kind of moderation, but did hold them liable if they tried to exercise moderation. This created a problem of good Samaritans. Those who tried to provide a better service for users were punished. And this meant that users themselves would be punished because to avoid liability, providers would either disable user speech or let it be drowned in a cacophony of spam and chaos, making social media practically unusable. So Congress enacted Section 230, which explicitly states, and I want to quote here, as its policy to, quote, encourage the development of technologies which maximize user control. This is in Section 230. And to, quote, remove disincentives for the development and utilization of technologies that empower users. Now, in practice, what we have witnessed since then, be it in the US, in the EU, or in Brazil, is not the empowering of users. Instead, as it has been extensively argued, platforms have been calling the shots with little accountability, what many have called the self-regulation model. Obviously, regulatory frameworks like the EU's Digital Services Act and proposals under consideration elsewhere, like Brazil, aim to change that. They're born out of a growing consensus that the self-regulatory model is inadequate in no small part because of the perception that platforms will prioritize economic considerations, even short-term interests over the public interest, and maybe that's an understatement. So the DSA, which is leading the charge here, creates new obligations for online platforms and very large online platforms. Obviously, I can't do the DSA justice here in the time that I have. But for a shorthand, I like the idea of the DSA as GDPR for platforms. The parallel only goes so far, but the relevant part here is that the DSA relies on compliance mechanisms like the GDPR does, and also incentivizes voluntary codes of conduct like the GDPR does. Crucially, very large online platforms have to conduct risk assessments and adopt risk mitigation measures. Yet the question here, I think, is that the DSA is trying to build a new edifice for the digital public sphere and relying on the same actors we distrust to be the architects. The DSA and second generation frameworks in general are overlooking users and communities. Like first generation frameworks before them, they are failing the digital third estate. Granted, I shouldn't be too quick in saying that. Celia has just mentioned how the DSA creates due process obligations, enhances transparency requirements. But I think the DSA overlooks the potential in users as a source of platform governance. This is something that I think second generation platform regulation should take into account. Now, how can this be achieved, and how is that different from promoting more user control? There are a couple of ways. One exciting prospect, I think, is extending the notion of citizens' assemblies to platform governance. Citizens' assemblies have been emphasized by scholarship working on deliberative democracy for a while now. They have been analyzed to juries. The idea is to draw on the wisdom of regular people to deliberate about important questions a society faces, particularly ones where representative democracy typically leads to gridlocks, for instance, electoral reform. Some version of this has been used in Canada, the Netherlands, and Scotland, to name a few countries. There are now active projects trying to draw on citizens' assemblies for platforms. Aviv Ovadaya has done pioneering work around this, and I encourage you to check out Aviv's paper for the Harvard Kennedy School, which outlines this. He has recently reported that he's working with Facebook on pilots around this idea, but I think the jury's still out. The second way to integrate users in platform governance would be to empower communities. And I think this ties back to the title of our panel today, which has a specific focus on collective as well as individual users' empowerment. So when we talk about social media and community approaches, maybe Mastodon is what comes to mind. The idea is that instead of having one centralized point of control at the hands of billionaires and mammoth transnational corporations, social media can be decentralized. In Mastodon's case, this happens by running instances, each its own mini Twitter, that set and enforce their own policies. Instances can also decide to defederate other instances when they find them objectionable, severing their network. There's a lot of potential here, but also a number of challenges. First, community content moderation is laborious, particularly when communities don't have access to the arsenal of automated tools that is part and parcel of platforms' industrial content moderation. Second, communities lack the resources that platforms have to make global scale operations possible. This will be very familiar to those who tried to join Mastodon recently after Elon Musk took over Twitter, only to find out the most popular instances were no longer accepting members. Or after having joined, couldn't post or access or browse their feeds because the servers were overwhelmed. It also doesn't stop at servers. One question with Mastodon is that the interface can seem unattractive to users who have grown used to how Twitter looks like, or at least used to look like before Musk laid off the team in charge of that. Corporations can pay to have the most skilled people working not just in user interface, but on every aspect that makes a platform more engaging. You might think that Reddit, which is also community-based, can provide the answer. And I think there's a lot to like in Reddit, including how they work with two sets of policies and enforcement, community-based and site-wide. Reddit also offers some automated tools for community moderators, which makes their lives easier. But Reddit is not a federation in the way that Mastodon seeks to be, because there's nothing to make them do good by their commitments towards communities legally or technically. So at any point, Reddit can change the rules and there's nothing you can say about it. Another potential model is, of course, the Wikimedia Foundation, which supports Wikipedia, MediaWiki, and other wiki services. Yet there are clear differences between the missions of Wikimedia and social media. So how can the law and regulation address these challenges for community empowerment? That's the question I'm currently working on. I think we are missing an enormous opportunity if our new frameworks don't leverage communities for platform governance. I think we should incentivize, use regulation to incentivize community empowerment within platforms. This could be done through tweaking intermediary liability regimes to make this an attractive option for corporations, for instance. Maybe we can talk about this more later in the session. I want to add, almost at time, I think, so I want to end it with a caveat. We shouldn't expect that community or user empowerment will solve every question in platform governance. There will still be hard cases and controversial decisions, and I'm not saying that communities will have all the answers ready, but I don't think that's the point. The point is that communities can be a much better place to have those conversations from the bottom up, within a meaningful set of shared commitments, social norms, and values. Most importantly, communities need not be faced with distrust, which is inherent to governance by major transnational corporations. So I will end there and happy to hear your thoughts later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arthur. So our next speaker had his flight delayed, and so he's traveling right now. So he sent us a video recording of his presentation. So it's Luca Belli, who's professor at FGV School of Law in Brazil, and he's also director of the Center for Technology and Society. Here is the video.
Good morning to everyone, and thank you very much for having invited me to this event organized in the context of the UNESCO conference on the Internet of Trust. My name is Luca Belli, professor at the FGV Law School, particularly at the Center for Technology and Society. And my contribution of today is based on a recent paper dedicated to meaningful and interoperable transparency. So let me share one side of my PowerPoint so that you can also visualize some elements of this research. Now, the paper I'm basically on has been published 4 months ago in the context of the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum. It was elaborated together with other colleagues of the IGF coalition on platform responsibility. And it is really about identifying what are the key elements of transparency. We speak a lot about this buzzword about which everyone agrees that is a very important concept, but we rarely identify what are the key elements of transparency to understand how really we can achieve meaningful transparency and how this type of transparency can be adopted in an interoperable fashion in various legal systems, by various platforms, in various electronic systems. This was really what this paper was about, in finding elements, meaningful and interoperable transparency. So the first question is, why meaningful and interoperable transparency? I was speaking about this, what is relevant? On the one hand, transparency is essential to achieve accountability and be both vital for trust, to foster trust in platforms. Only if you know what platforms are, what information they are processing, and how and why, and if you are, only if you as users and also society and regulators are able to understand really what type of processing are happening, then in this case, platform can be held accountable, and people, users, society, regulators can trust. So to achieve this kind of transparency is important to have not only a quantitative approach, but qualitative.
Okay, it seems like the technical conditions that do not permit to really hear well what Luca had to say, but I hope you understood that they have developed a recent framework for meaningful and interoperable transparency, and with the goal of promoting transparency and accountability, foster trust in platforms, many other aspects that I cannot discuss myself, but I hope during the discussion all together we can address this question. So before starting discussion and opening to the audience, to the whole audience, are there some reactions that panelists want to have to the talks from the others?
Yeah, okay. I just want to say something to Celia. I think this is a very good example of the same direction that I had in mind. So, I'm sorry. So, what Celia's example, I think, a very good, better illustration of my own example, what I have in mind, because if you have the aim that we have to a right that people should be able to set and modify parameters, for example. Okay, this is a nice vision. It's a good law, and it transfers a right. But then it's essential how we implement it. So what you named, you referred to dashboards, for example. We work with dashboards a lot now, right? And it's of course not very easy to make a dashboard which is really easy to use, and it's really transparent, which has all the information in a simple way and in a good way. So, but that is exactly what I have in mind, and so that we have this. It does not make sense alone to say we have a right. We cannot simply say we now must bring the users learn the competences to deal with a complex system, to set the parameters in their own interest. We have to think hard in the next step how to implement technologically such a, and this is myself very important step. Another example you mentioned on the side was, well, if you say, well, people should discuss publicly problems. Well, it again sounds very nice, but if you look at the momentarily on the technological systems which are offered to do this, like forum systems, then they have 100 people doing comments. You got this very, very, very long list of comments and comments of the comments, and nobody is going to read them. If there are many people, you know, the more, the less it is usable. So we have to think about systems where, for example, arguments are exchanged one after the other, and where an intelligent system goes on an argumentation map and get the argument from there in the logical correct way and present them one after the other. For example, another example for not an easy to do technological system. So I think your examples are very good to again illustrate, I think, this very important point that we must have a technological environment where we have a realistic chance to develop the competence which are needed. There are still competence needed, of course, but the competence must be assimilated or we must assimilate the technological environment to possible competences. Well, my very simple example that's always in mind, when I bought my first car in the 60s or 70s, it was an old VW Beetle. I had a lot of technical competence to drive this car, because sometimes it breaks down. I have to get out, look at the engine, repair parts, and how to. And this was a special competence which we don't need today, fortunately. But we need other competences to drive a modern car. So this is always what I have in mind when I think we have to adapt the environment in a way that people are really able to. With I think your example is very good.
Thank you. That's our main research with various colleagues, including maybe, in fact, we are now studying how to design these new tools to empower users as individuals and also as communities, with another colleague, Stefana Broadbent, very involved in this field of open science and OpenStreetMap, etc., and how to imagine new tools to create joint attention and collective online platforms. So that are one of our goals, to bring together legal aspect, design aspects, neuroscience aspects, just to create, to imagine what could be these new tools. So as you mentioned, for example, for the forum, the question is, in fact, what is the goal with this creation of and development of the forum? It was probably to let the people express themselves and not to organize a real discussion and argumentation, etc. So maybe what we should do is to determine first the goal, and for example, legally speaking, and to respect a right, a user's right, and think, well, the design of the interface architecture to promote the respect of this right. So this is one of our main issue. We have now, for example, in France, the French Personal Data Authority, CNIL, launched several working groups on this question of data and design. You mentioned also the work of the European Data Protection Board, especially on social network, regarding dark patterns. And we had various documents published by the UK regulator and competition law and consumer law, I think, thinking about what we should do with dark patterns, manipulated consumer choice and impacting competition. We had this very good document of the OECD on commercial dark patterns. And in the document of the competition authority of the UK, they mentioned a very important point, and we work on this, is how we have to include, as you mentioned also, neuroscience research, multidisciplinary researchers in this studying of the impact of design of interfaces on, for example, consumer's choice, but that is one point, but also on the public choice regarding information or public debate or election, for example. So it's a very important issue, and we have to cross our view. We have to study together, and maybe it's a good way to meet together and to develop this research after. And the UK regulatory authority mentioned the necessity to involve also here consumers, but we can say here users, to organize a collective group to expose them to kind of fake manipulation and help them to understand what is a manipulation, to look what they was their reaction, and after to be re-exposed to another kind of manipulation and to see if they take benefit for the first experience, not to be manipulated another time. So we have some experience in France now for consumer kind of fraud, launched by the Ministry of Finance and Economy, I guess, maybe.
Formation.
Yeah, and public transformation, including neuroscientists, etc. So it's one of our, maybe one of a way we can go. And another, maybe another thing could be just to, but maybe it's naive or utopic, but I tell you, the idea could be that to incentivize, maybe impose to online platforms to use their A/B testing they use to adapt their interfaces regarding the user experience. We know that this is the model of Facebook, of Mark Zuckerberg since the origin of Facebook, of the Facebook, and maybe to ask them to do A/B testing just to understand the good way to incentivize, to empower users. Maybe it's naive, but I tell you, this could be naive.
Thank you. Other reactions, Arthur, online?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. I think those are all great points, and I'll keep it short by saying that communities, we do have experiences with communities right now that we not just algorithmic ranking, but also platform design. So on Reddit, platform design is also something that to a limited extent subreddits can change. And I think the concerns that Michael raised with regards to expertise can be significantly mitigated once we take into account the mediating role of communities. So I would encourage everyone to think on communities as a kind of we might think of it as a kind of delegation of powers, or actually devolving of powers from platforms to the users through communities. So maybe I'll just leave it there very briefly.
Yeah, thank you, Arthur.
Well, just in the last sessions, we had these proposals to introduce user communities inside platforms like kind of democratic parliaments where they can discuss about the principles of content moderation, for example. And I think this is I think it's a very good strategy to think about how we can combine legal regulations and self-governance institutions, because legal regulations alone will never do it. But then again, if you introduce this kind of platform, democratic parliaments inside the platform, then again the question arises: how do we organize discussions in this parliament? Because they are not parliaments like we of course in the non-digital world. So again, it would be very, very important to have very efficient and easy to use discussion means, because we know from our own experiments we did on democratic participation with digital means. In our experiments, we saw that people very, very quickly get out. They tried 1 or 2 times. They say, "Oh no, it's too complicated. I have to the access to it too complicated. The arguments I cannot read such things," and they are out after 1 or 2 tries. So I think it's not at all a trivial problem. For example, how to install participation or discussion augmentation tools where people come together. Of course, the goal, I accept the goal totally, but we have to be serious about the problems we face there. We were very naive 20 years ago in thinking just when we open the internet, everybody will discover it. We know out today that's not the case. But yeah, but of course the goal is completely, I completely agree.
I've been listening to your discussion and observations, and I want to come back to the topic of digital competencies. Digital competencies, stated by a number of speakers, is needed in order to empower users. A couple of observations. First of all, it's a moving target. As mentioned, what's needed today is different than 10 years ago and likely 10 years from now. Also, it reminds me a little bit on one hand, Europe has thought about the idea of developing a European computer driver's license. That's one end of the stick, one of the metrics. And then I was also thinking about what Nana mentioned about people who are not literate, who cannot read. We provide them with symbols or graphics to explain what the rules are. So it's a very wide variety to empower people to be part of and make use of that system. So I just want your take on how are we going to define when digital competency is enough? What do we have to do?
Maybe I will illustrate and explain what we are doing with my student, for my legal student. And we have a series of actions to help to fight against hate speech, online hate speech. And so my students developed some kind of educational format to go to meet young people in the suburb of Paris and to explain what we studied together concerning what is freedom of expression, how we can express ourselves in social media, what is an abuse, legally speaking, what are the sanctions, and also what are these cognitive bias used by, for example, online platforms, how the legal framework impose some rules, or we have this evolution with the DSA and the DMA now. So we discuss, and this is one experience. It won't be the same if we will discuss with, for example, students in a school of data scientists that will well know the architecture and maybe not the business models, the economic purposes of such online platform services. So maybe we can have a lot of experience, and that's what we can be very useful to share this various experience with video testimony and to have online platform just to share these materials we had and not to impose like top-down model inadequate because it's very context-based approach and each of us needs something different. So it could be just to have a bottom-up approach and to share various experiences and to propose material, a kit, educational kits maybe. I don't know if it's okay. Just to make us think about what is technology, how we can use it, what technology is doing to our society, and maybe, sorry for this example, but maybe ChatGPT is a good example because we are a lot to try to use a ChatGPT just to understand what is the answer of ChatGPT in our topic, in general culture, etc., etc. So we try to understand well how ChatGPT is functioning, and but for me, for example, I'm not a data scientist or a researcher of AI, so the importance is to understand if the response is fake or exact, if the response is well argumented, and why is not the case. And maybe it's a good thing to understand well the functioning of the culture and to try to understand what we need to know better.
Yeah, I would like actually to jump in this discussion of helping the user better understand the system. And actually, yeah.
Very, very brief to ChatGPT. It's a good example for the pros and cons. On the one hand side, you can see, well, ChatGPT could be a really good possibility to explain people who have no time to check themselves long lists of Google and look into the websites, to just summarize things and say very briefly and explain very briefly something to you. On the other hand, of course, it is right what it says. So what kind of competence do you need to then check it, or what kind of hints could we give people that maybe they should look at another place? So I think this is, you have these two sides again, and then you see the moving target. So if the AI is talking to you, you need very different competences to judge the reliability of this conversation than, for example, to judge the reliability of some disinformation from some source. So it is always changing, and I'm afraid I think there's no general answer to what's digital competence. Sorry, but I think
yeah, actually that makes me give me the opportunity to talk about the notion of playability in order to better understand the system. So how far should we push forward this right to set the parameters, maybe a right to play with the system in order to better understand it? And I think it's important to understand how much we need it. And I would like to step back to ancient Greece, the agora, the space where people will meet to discuss. In this agora, where anybody stepping in knows what are the rules. So it's similar to an example, the stadium, there are rules. But these rules are not only the rules of social interaction, they are also physical rules. As a human, I know that if with my strength, if I push a column made of stone, I will not make it fall. But if I take a small stone and throw it at another citizen, I will hurt that person. These are rules that I can infer from, I can generalize from my experience in other contexts. While here, digital platforms are complex systems. It's very difficult to really understand them. And from the point of view of a scientist, there's this notion that, and I would like to quote the physicist Richard Feynman, what I cannot create, I cannot understand. So we have to model a physical system to really understand it. So maybe we should introduce possibilities to play with a platform, to even configure it, to understand what are the consequences of one's action in that world. So is it something we could push forward in this proposition regulation?
I'm asking a question. It would be interesting to see if Arthur has a view on this as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanna-
Can you hear me?
I want to pick up on this notion of
Okay, Arthur, just a second.
playing with the platform.
Yeah.
So I think one area for policy development that could be very helpful is what's sometimes called interoperability policy. So right now, the platforms don't really have to let anyone play with the way that the platform is experienced by the users. And so there's a lot of discussion here, and I think it's warranted about how can we have some global framework for regulating the platforms and improving the experience for users. But the tools of policymaking, especially at a global level, reaching down through federations of nation states, are not fundamentally well structured for the challenge of meeting users who are connected via networks, not via national unities, on these platforms that are fundamentally international. The people who are really going to be able to improve the user experience are technologists, probably who have some sort of understanding of networks and maybe social psychology. These are going to be the people who create the technologies that the users can use to improve their experience. And what's really needed from policymakers is just a policy that says the platforms need to play nicely with these third-party tools. We could have tools that allow people to filter the quality of the content in their newsfeed. So a user could say, I want to make sure there's no hate speech in my newsfeed. The user could say, I want to make sure that the news articles in my newsfeed are above, a 70 out of 100 and a credibility score from this third-party filtering mechanism. But those third-party mechanisms cannot get off the ground without the help of governments forcing the platforms to play nicely.
Yeah. Thank you, Arthur. You wanted to also reply or continue the discussion on this topic?
Yeah, but I don't know if we maybe want to discuss the interoperability question that or comment that was just raised, and then I can address the previous.
Yeah, but actually, you also have things to say on interoperability. No, or
Sure.
No, you want? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I can
go ahead.
So I think that's an important point, and this ties to a question we got from Nora Bouvet, who says decentralizing social media is an interesting idea. In practice, it seems quite irreconcilable with the current business models of online platforms. So taking a step back, does it necessarily imply a structural, political, and economic change of society at large? I think to those points, to the point about interoperability and to this question, I think we should think, this is how I think about it. To a considerable extent, the only way that platforms can actually operate, and this is what they tell us, is dependent on the intermediary liability regimes we have adopted. So there's now the US Supreme Court will hear argument today about whether or not platforms are protected for their algorithmic ranking decisions under Section 230. And an important part of the argument there is that without that protection, and remember, we're talking about the United States, so platforms, even as private businesses, would still have protection and perhaps to a greater extent elsewhere in the world for their own speech decisions. But platforms are still saying that they need the statutory protections that Section 230 grants them, because otherwise they would be put out of business just on litigation costs. So I think if we flip this on its head, I think what they're telling us is that law is much more important to their business practices than perhaps we usually talk about it. And I think that also ties to the question about interoperability. Another way to talk about it would be to reconsider network effects as a function of just economics, and think about network effects as a function of the protections platforms have to appropriate the result of network effects and to bar everyone else from plugging into their networks. And I think that Nicholas Guckenberger law professor at UC, University of Houston Law Center, is doing interesting work with that as well. So again, to both of those points, my proposal would be, maybe we think about how changing regimes we have and the platforms are telling us they need to operate could be tweaked to incentivize platforms into devolving authority they now have. And I wanted to touch on the question of competency, because I also want to flip the question on its head there. I think, so first of all, there's a way in which communities have much more expertise or competency than platforms, any other actor. And I think my point here is that it's only communities who have a sense of social norms, who are developing a purpose for the space they're creating, who can, on the basis of those purposes, and not some abstract notions about freedom of expression, not some legalese way of trying to frame those questions. Only communities that can provide meaningful, politically normative answers to many of the issues we are discussing around misinformation, hate speech, etc. And so let me tell you how I think that's important. When we think about how, say, a university instructor grades a test, say someone in a history exam comes up with a story that's completely negationist, revisionist account of history, the instructor assessing that test will not draw on abstract notions of freedom of expression and international human rights law. They'll just draw on the purposes of higher education and the mission they see for their discipline, and of course what was taught at that discipline, at that specific course, to grade and perhaps just give a failing grade to that student. And I think it's much easier to respond to those questions, to revisionism, when we have a specific context, when we don't go to too abstract notions and too high-level notions about freedom of expression in general. So what I'm trying to draw here is a parallel between platforms as, about communities as being in the place, ideally placed to develop those norms, and I don't think that platforms can be the ones in doing that. And one last note, again, to the question of competency, and I know that we'll have, obviously, there's a number of intricate questions around platform governance, and Michael told us that having a parliament for platforms might be tricky because people generally aren't interested. And I think that's where the notion of citizens' assemblies can come into play. You can brief only a set of individuals who are then representative of a community. You can make sure they're all informed and that they're taking all relevant factors into account. And those individuals, you can make them more interested, you can offer them compensation, etc. Kind of like you can think about representative democracy in general. So I think that's also an interesting question to deal with concerns about competency.
Yeah, and after we'll take questions from
I just would like to add something about playability. You mentioned, Mehdi, and what you talk about with your question. In France, we have the French CNIL, so the data protection authorities that launch a website and a design workshop just to put into movement the information and to show how the cookies work, and when you are surfing on various websites, how much cookies are you have, and the graph, etc., etc. And you can play with this cookie viz dashboard. So that's new kind of tools, and the objective is not to help the CNIL so the French data protection regulator to sanction website. No, the objective is training everyone and showing what's happened with cookies and to help you to take your decision just to accept all, to refuse all, or to configure it what you want. So it's new kind of tool. And here the interest is that with this tool proposed by the French CNIL, with designers, with other stakeholders, you have a tool for everyone. And for example, for consumers or designers to think other way you want to use this website. So maybe this concept of playability, putting the information into movement, having way to show and to play with, to train is a good way. And the objective is not again, not to sanction, but to I don't like the word educate, but to train and to use also the reputational tool. So you can compare various practices, and we know the impact, the potential impact of reputation, including for online platforms. So this is a possible solution.
Yeah, completely different topic. Arthur mentioned a couple of times Clause 230 of the Consumer Decency Act in the States. The DSA has been mentioned. This is a Service Act of Europe, but this is an American act. This is a European act. So what does this mean for people who do not live in the States or in Europe? How can we make sure that they also have rules and regulations you're going to apply for them?
Who would like to answer this point?
That is the main challenge. Maybe it's one goal of these guidelines of UNESCO regulating online platform. When we discuss about what we've done with the DSA in the EU, other states ask the same question. But we have to be careful to have the well thinking about how this European kind of model could be adapted to other kind of context. So maybe again we could try to discuss the good practices of the DSA. For example, this risk analysis is a very good tool, I think, just to impose online platforms to check the risk of their services, of online architectures, algorithmic systems, and social impacts, and to identify if this could be interesting for all users around the world. I guess it's okay for this. Maybe others rules are not well adapted. And so just to discuss all these rules and proposal in the UNESCO guideline could be very important. But the question is how you go from principles to real actions. And so that's the next step we have to think about.
Nina, I think you wanted to make a point.
Do I have a right to ask a question?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So I want to come back to the interoperability thing, because my understanding of this panel is empowerment. And the way I translate empowerment to myself is freedom of choice. Now, I'm not faulting the guideline, but I want to raise something that we seem not to capture very well. In the old days, we used to talk about vendor lock-in. But in those days, what I found out, I don't know, anyone here on Mastodon? Oh, goodness. Right. So over the years, Yesterday, I celebrated 14 years on Twitter. I've been about 18 on Facebook. Over the years, YouTube videos no longer play automatically on Facebook. Facebook links no longer preview on Telegram. What else again? LinkedIn links. LinkedIn now shortens links to go to LinkedIn when you cross-post on Twitter. So what I have found out, I may be wrong, that's why I'm putting this to the panel, is that platforms have a clear intention of retaining the user. So Google wants you to spend all your life on Alphabet, buy there, sleep there, do everything there. Who remembers when Facebook wanted to give us emails? Who remember doing emails from Facebook? Who are these people? So Facebook wants you to shop. Facebook wants you to do everything. Facebook wants you to message your videos, all your digital. So my worry is that even if we form a community, I do a lot of community stuff. At least you've heard of Facebook Oversight Board. Goodness, okay. So there are community-driven initiatives for real. But my worry is that community initiatives remain within the same platform, right? And I cannot cross-fertilize my Facebook community with my Twitter community or my Telegram community. You see what I mean? So, because I think that the platforms kind of want me to live there and die there and spend all my time, all my money, everything there. So how can we leverage? How can I be empowered? How can I be free? How can I cross-fertilize? Because that is what I think will empower me as a user. But over the years, I think that collaboration or interoperability, as we call it in technical standards, is going down. And it does not seem to be captured in the guidelines because we are making guidelines for stuff that happens in the Twitter kingdom, Facebook for stuff that happens in Facebook kingdom, Telegram for stuff that happens in Telegram kingdom. How am I empowered as a user?
So, well, I have no complete answer, of course not, but I would say answers can have two aspects. The one aspect is the direct intervention in the systems by legal regulations. So to say, well, this is I think in Germany there was try to get the interoperability of data. So I have the right to take my data with me if I need. Okay, this would be direct interventions, but there would be indirect intervention, and this would be to enforce, to strengthen competition between the platforms, or to be more severe on anti-monopoly legislation, for example, so that remember when WhatsApp was bought by Facebook. Yeah, and this by Meta, and of course this could have been prevented if there was a legal thing against this. So I think there are, and maybe we should not underestimate the indirect strengthening of the market, so that competition can be more easier, or that we can fight against monopolies. And I'm not so pessimistic that over technological innovations, competition will again be possible, as we see now with ChatGPT. So I think these are both two possibilities to go in the direction. Maybe it's not a complete answer, but these are two aspects of it. I would make the difference between the two, the direct and indirect.
And maybe that's why the Digital Markets Act in the EU want to promote this new right of contestability. It's not competition law, it's not unfair commercial practices, but it's linked to how to ensure that innovation could benefit everyone and not only one single company, which could organize a monopoly in its own ecosystems. So this is the goal of the digital markets. Sorry for the European model, but it's quite interesting because in the heart of the negotiation of the DMA was the principle of interoperability. So we discuss a lot of how we can organize, impose interoperability at the end of the text, because we wanted to adopt this text, and it was a very quick adoption for European text with a lot of compromise usually, etc. But adopted in 2 years at quite a very good thing. We decide that we impose interoperability for private communication, such as WhatsApp, etc., but not for social media. And it's we have a delay of 3 years to study the technical difficulties launched during the debates, the negotiation of the DMA, to go further and maybe to develop standards in the W3, the World Wide Web Foundation, just to go further these technical difficulties and to develop different kind of technical possibilities, such as personal information management systems, etc., etc. Maybe I can recommend you the proposals promoted by 2 colleagues, Jean Catan and Serge Abitboul. They are studying the question of social media and how we are social media and how to promote this interoperability principle to empower individuals and communities. So it's a very interesting proposal they make, if I may.
There was a question in the back. You've been waiting for a long time.
Hi, thanks a lot. My name is Omri Price from Alliance for Europe and the Bazaar Foundation. We mentioned communities a lot here in this discussion. I think it would be important to talk about who we mean and why, because just because I'm on Facebook doesn't mean that I feel any sense of community with other people on Facebook. Just like when I walk into a supermarket, I'm not necessarily in a community with those other shoppers. And so if we talk about communities in different contexts, we need to understand what is the purpose of the community. So let's say if we have people who want to defend democracy, they have a sense of purpose. And then for a community to function, we need common languages in order to share data, share analysis, to be able to take effective action together. And we also need forums through which to cooperate and tools that we can use. So I think those are very clear elements that are needed in order to mobilize for action. And then, whether it's civil society carrying out advocacy or consumers protecting themselves, whoever it may be. And then just as a last tidbit, we also really need to remember in this discussion that these platforms are not public spaces. And even if we remember that sort of somewhere in the back of our heads, we tend to veer towards talking about them as if they are a public marketplace or a public town square, which they are not. So if we're talking about information as a public good, we also certainly need to talk about digital public space where this public good could be distributed. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anna.
Well, I very, very strongly underpin this because, well, you have to think about well, I'm a sociologist. So what was the history of the community concept? The history of the community concept, of course, is very rich. And the community concept is very rich. So as you said, common goal, common language, common interest, exchange over in a quite density. And this concept was stolen by the social platforms. And of course, what they call community, what we now use to call community ourselves, is of course not the community in this stark sense, in this deep sense. And And this, the first thing, and the second thing, we talk about this on the side when talking about participation and then an argumentation inside the internet. I think, well, it's our duty, that means civil society, to create really public spaces on the internet that are not part of the platforms, and this we were not successful in doing this up to now. We have to acknowledge, and this is also a technological problem. Of course, not only a technological problem, but it's also a technological problem. How to create a technological room where these communities then can interact. But I think that to the last word to this, I think that the real digital communities will grow out of communities outside the digital world. But the roots, I think, will be outside
So I've seen many people have questions, and this discussion is really stimulating, but we are close to the end of this session. So we would like to take one question from the online audience. You want my mic?
And it's a question for Arthur. Isn't community moderation far more prone to majoritarianism, and thus doesn't it offer less protection for unpopular views and dissent? We see this with Mastodon. So some people are on Mastodon. I hope you are relieved, Nena. Where the most popular instances have very restrictive speech rules, which have kicked off many.
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so I think that's a great question, and I'll try to tie that question to the other question about community. And I think I'll start by saying we're talking about communities, plural, and it's certainly not the Facebook community, which I agree is a stretch to think as a community. So why do I think it's relevant that we're talking about communities, plural? I don't think there isn't one single standard of freedom of expression that applies to all communities or to all social contexts. And the extent to which we value freedom of expression varies according to the social context we are, and communities are a part of how we define each social context. So again, in the classroom, I'll go back to the education example. In the classroom, you can't speak at any point of a class. There are occasions when you can speak, and you can only speak about issues that are relevant to what's being discussed. And how do I think this ties back to the question? So I think it might be the case that some communities don't want to be as tolerant of let's say off-topic speech as other communities, and that might be legitimate reasons for that. But I also want to acknowledge the concern that some communities might be, even for the social norms that they share or are committed to upholding, might be not as tolerant of minority positions. And I think the point that this is plural communities and that these decisions are made from the bottom up might be especially relevant here. So one last point to the issue about interoperability that Nena raised, and I'll agree with what was said and add one thing. Obviously, interoperability is an important part of discussion, and I think we should go there. But there's a sense in which we can only have an imagined audience if we think about that audience in terms of not just the network, but also platform affordances and design as well. There's an super interesting blog post by Arvind Narayanan at the United Prince Amendment Institute at Columbia University, which tries to tell us that although we've been thinking about TikTok in terms of its killer algorithms, he thinks design is much more important. And I think when you think about Twitter and you think about Mastodon, that there's something about the fact that you can't see link previews. There's something about the fact that you can't hold tweets, etc. Those are all aspects of user interface There are not aspects about networks, and maybe there are not questions about that interoperability might answer. And again, if you have communities, you can experiment with those components of design and affordances within a platform, and that might have its own value. So I'll stop that because I know we're close to time.
Thank you very much. And I would like to thank all the contributors to this roundtable. It's been a fantastic discussion, and we see plenty of directions and room for improvements to go further the guidelines. Thank you all.